Here's the Vigil answer, but what was the Vigil question? Mystery unfolds on TurboWorks Episode 4. Irem's Vigilante joins the launch day festivities for TurboGrafx-16. But did Sega really deserve to be hit with this violent version of justice? You know Vigilante, of course. I looked at this game not too long ago, back on Segaiden. The Master System version appeared in the US about 3 months before the Genesis and TurboGrafx-16 launched. And for a very short while, that Arc System Works adaptation stood as the finest walk-and-punch game on the US console market. More solid than Arc's own Double Dragon, less muddled by leveling mechanics and grinding than Double Dragon's NES adaptation, more confident than Bad Dudes. Vigilante for Master System looked excellent and played, well, it's just a juiced-up Kung Fu, like all of these games. But it looked much prettier than NES Kung Fu, and it added interesting new elements like temporary weapons and more dynamic boss battles. So it was the king of the Kill Hill for an entire fiscal quarter. But then came Genesis and Altered Beast, and TurboGrafx and China Warrior, both doing the Kung Fu but fancier thing with even greater aplomb. Bad news for that early port of Vigilante. The real kick in the ass, though, arrived alongside China Warrior. A chance for a true apples-to-apples comparison between the Master System and TurboGrafx-16 to show just what a leap NEC offered over that older generation of consoles. I will say that Vigilante for Master System holds up better in the face of its next-gen-ish counterpart than Altered Beast for Master System did, but, well, that's to be expected. It still comes away looking much more meager and limited by comparison, and it's here that I think the reality sets in. Of all the consoles in the active American tech race as of August 1989, Master System was hurt the most by the advent of 16-bit. And while you might think the more limited NES would suffer most, the fundamental TurboGrafx-16 ethos can be summed up as the NES but better, after all. Vigilante establishes a pattern of everyone kind of sticking it to Master System. In this case, the presence of this exact game on Sega's older console pales in comparison to Irem's own TurboGrafx-16 port. And don't get me wrong, the Master System version was honestly as good as you could possibly expect from a pure 8-bit console of the era. It included all of the arcade game's levels, its enemies and bosses, its mechanics, and its settings. The graphics boasted some great detail too, with strong color and shading. And the music didn't sound bad, even if Americans couldn't enjoy the secret FM-enhanced soundtrack. Even so, the Master System struggled with the game. Maybe not obviously so when experienced in isolation, but side by side with a recreation that approaches arcade perfection, the limit of Sega's system really become obvious. I hate that this channel has taken a turn toward Master System slagging of late, but that's the reality of the 16-bit console transition. No one expected arcade-perfect performance from the NES or Atari's system at this point, and most developers had long since given up on directly porting coin-op software to NES in favor of totally recreating a game into something that bore little resemblance to anything else bearing the same title. If you were buying NES games in 1989, it wasn't because you wanted a true, pixel-precise recreation of your favorites from the local Aladdin's Castle. You bought NES games because you wanted some sort of interesting new experience inspired by the hits that you saw at the Putt-Putt Rec Room. Well, statistically speaking, you probably bought NES games because you owned an NES and, being a child, had an annual game-buying budget that afforded you a new cartridge once every few months, and certainly didn't have room to drop $300 on a new 16-bit console and a few games to go along with it. But let's not be pedants here. On the other hand, Sega more or less sold the Master System on the promise of arcade-perfect adaptations. These began to fall behind after a while, but the Master System still held the claim to being the most powerful console in America for a couple of years. So yeah, maybe Space Harrier 3D wasn't great, but where were you going to play anything that looked more impressive than that? NES? Atari 7800? Intellivision? Please. But once the TurboGrafx and Genesis arrived, the tenuous nature of those Master System creations really became apparent. And when you could hold up identical software between the two systems, like, say, Vigilante, it certainly didn't look too good for Master System. I'd say that Vigilante does more comparative damage to the appeal of Master System than even Sega's own Super Thunderblade. Sure, Super Thunderblade looked and played a lot better than the Master System iteration, but it still suffered massive compromises to its visuals and presentation and play mechanics in making the move to Genesis versus the coin-op rendition. But Vigilante looks and plays great on TurboGrafx-16, to the point that you would probably have trouble itemizing the shortcomings without a direct side-by-side comparison. The arcade version had a softer color palette, slightly more detailed and multi-layered background graphics. It could display slightly more enemies on screen at a time, and perhaps most visibly, it included scrolling backdrops and mini stages. This home port lacks those things. But aside from the very obvious single-layer backgrounds, the particulars of these changes are so minuscule that only the most obsessive, anal-retentive types would notice when they booted up Vigilante on TurboGrafx for their own TV. Even more so than Altered Beast on Genesis, this feels like a genuine arcade-at-home experience, down to the enemy logic. Granted, Altered Beast operated at a higher level of arcade tech, so it's still the more impressive console adaptation, but still, if arcade-perfect home games was your bag, Vigilante for TurboGrafx presented a compelling argument for that system. Honestly, the biggest drawback to Vigilante is that it shipped alongside China Warrior. Did we really need 2 scrolling brawlers on this console on day one? I would argue that we didn't. Any more than Genesis also needed 2 scrolling brawlers on day one. I guess this is what happens when you ship a console right at the cusp of Final Fight in the Ninja Turtles arcade game. Put your finger in the wind, try to get a sense of which direction the zeitgeist is blowing, and make do with what you have. Vigilante doesn't look as impressive as China Warrior, with much smaller on-screen objects. I'd say it's the better game though, less of a pattern memorization exercise, and more of a study in managing space. And while its smaller visual elements may not have the same initial wow factor as that ersatz Bruce Lee, they're all far more detailed and packed with personality. Not only do you have to save Madonna, you have to do it in front of the pee-pee room. But if we're being honest, I'd really rather be playing Last Battle than this. Well, maybe not Last Battle as it actually exists, but Last Battle with another few weeks of development time to refine the controls and balancing and checkpoint system. I think that could have been a more interesting game than Vigilante's straightforward brawling. Given what we actually got though, I'd pick neither. But whatever. Altered Beast, Vigilante, China Warrior, Last Battle, all of these games look like amateur hour compared to the cultiest of cult classics that is Victor Interactive's Legendary Axe. To be fair, the Legendary Axe is not really cut from the same cloth as those other games I mentioned. All of those belong to the Spartan X Kung Fu Master School of Design, in which you move almost exclusively in one direction along an almost entirely flat surface, fending off enemies from both sides. They are very literal, two-dimensional games that barely acknowledge the existence of directions besides left and right. Legendary Axe revolves around melee combat as well, but it both integrates and respects the existence of the Y-axis. Your guy, a rowdy little caveman, beats up guys, well, mostly monsters, to his left and right. It's true. But he also jumps, he climbs, he drops into holes to find alternate paths and hidden treasures. Legendary Axe traces its ancestry back to, Ghosts and Goblins? A platform action game with a heavy focus on combat over athletics. One that's hard as hell and makes no apologies about it. The Ghosts and Goblins family tree split into melee and shooter families over time, with games like Mega Man going the latter route, and the likes of Rastan, Rygar, Strider, and Wonder Boy and Monsterland taking the former path. And then you had Black Tiger and Willow kind of being both because Capcom was weird. Anyway, the Legendary Axe is the coolest and most compelling of all the melee offshoots outside of Strider, because nothing is cooler than Strider. Not an opinion, just guaranteed scientific fact. You play as a caveman who has to battle his way through a lot of horrible, hateful, murderous levels in order to save the lady you love from a terrible death cult that wants to ritually sacrifice her. Not exactly breaking the mold here, but certainly working a lot darker than Mario's Save the Princess from a Magic Turtle tee-hee whimsy. I do not invoke Mario's name lightly. Well, not this time anyway. I feel that Mario merits mention here because I have found that many TurboGrafx-16 aficionados feel that the Legendary Axe was to the console as Super Mario Bros. Was to the NES, the system seller that should have been the pack-in from the start. I do agree that it is both a better game than Keith Courage and Alpha Zones, and also has an aesthetic and theme that make it a much better fit for American tastes and expectations. A burly guy with a huge-ass axe, running around a world that looked like heavy metal album covers, trying to save a hot lady from an evil wizard. Packing that in with the system certainly would have pitched the console immediately toward the older, more teen-oriented crowd that NEC and TTI would eventually gravitate toward. But I guess maybe that was the point of shipping it separately. Stick a kinda mediocre, all-ages card in as a freebie, then upsell the new console's owners for the sick, gruesome, cool stuff like this in Alien Crush. It's hard to say that the Legendary Axe would have moved any additional units as a pack-in anyway. According to a game developer interview with former NEC executive John Greiner, the company didn't exactly have a killer marketing budget after optimistically manufacturing way more units than they received orders for at launch. So they struggled to get the word out about the console in the first place. NEC actually centered its marketing message around Vigilante for the most part, memorably comparing it to the original Super Mario Bros., but really just in terms of visuals. This wasn't the most convincing side-by-side comparison for anyone who had paid any attention to the past 4 years of NES graphical evolution, but kids were more likely to take note of a great port of an arcade hit, like Vigilante, than they were something new. Like a lot of TurboGrafx-16 greats, the Legendary Axe had the disadvantage of not being tied to an existing property that American gamers could connect with. Ironically so, since the console's original material is its greatest strength in hindsight. But in 1989, it kind of worked against it. So honestly, the whole Keith Courage versus Legendary Axe's pack-in material debate is probably just a wash when it comes down to it. And all of this is just a sideshow to the fact that the Legendary Axe is pretty much peak 1989 action game. It looks really good, showcasing the TurboGrafx-16's visual capabilities to excellent effect. It controls smoothly, and it never feels overly complicated since it has to work with just 2 face buttons and a D-pad. Like an NES game. But no NES game would ever have had such solid, colorful, detailed graphics, or boast such sizable and fluidly animated sprites. And despite its clean control scheme, the Legendary Axe doesn't feel overly simplistic. Each stage is full of alternate routes. These aren't exactly secrets, since you often end up falling into one if enemy knocks you off a precarious perch. Though many pits are bottomless death traps, so this does require some trial and error experimentation. It's worth making the effort and dealing with the annoyance of an occasional untelegraphed death, because those side jaunts often reward you with valuable power-ups. The Legendary Axe empowers its hero with a 4-tier upgrade system for his base weapon. This is nothing mind-blowing. Each new tier of power you acquire simply lets you hit enemies harder than the last. But there's some nuance to it, as the Axe's power meter depletes and then automatically refills every time you give it a swing. It kind of feels like Square was cribbing from the Legendary Axe's homework when they designed the tiered weapon system in Secret of Mana. Both games share the same fundamental mechanic. Here, however, it's somewhat temporary, or at least fragile. If our loincloth warrior bites it after amping up his weapon, he'll lose a notch of max power and be forced to forage for a replacement. The more you die in succession, the more max levels you lose. This gives the game a bit of the death setbacks you would associate with a horizontal shooter, without feeling quite as punishing as the likes of Gradius, Darius, or R-Type. It certainly incentivizes not dying, though that's kind of a big ask. The Legendary Axe is tough. Enemies hit hard and can absorb quite a bit of punishment if you haven't managed to find enough upgrades to hit the upper power tiers. Bad guys approach from all directions, including from above, and your axe has a very particular timed element and hitbox that requires a pretty precise sense of space management. In that sense, at least, it has something in common with Vigilante, though I'd certainly give the Legendary Axe my vote as a game experience. Each stage consists of multiple phases en route to the boss, which creates a sort of natural checkpoint system. But actually making your way to and beyond the boss takes a lot of hard work beyond the first level. And our barbarian friend only has a few lives and a handful of continues to spend in his quest to conquer all 6 stages, survive the final boss, and rescue his remarkably pink lady friend Flare. I won't pretend that I'm anywhere near good enough to complete this game today in my dotage, but I can also say with confidence that the Legendary Axe is good enough and plays so well that I absolutely would have struggled my way through the whole thing over the course of a few weeks if I'd owned a TurboGrafx-16 back in my prime. Which I didn't, so I can only sit and marvel at the excellent TurboGrafx launch lineup and admire NEC's overall excellent work in picking selections to ship alongside the system, Keith Courage is a pack-in notwithstanding. Launch lineups tend to be pretty dicey, so seeing top-flight picks like Victory Run, Alien Crush, and now the Legendary Axe as part of its day one assortment certainly does make the console's financial failure in the US feel all the more like a grave injustice. Next time on TurboWorks, the console gets prosaic with perhaps the most does what it says in the box game to appear on the console.